on this topic today. I think that our panelists here have some really unique insights to put forth because while hate, supremacist ideologies, and all the associated violence, bias, and injustice that are associated with these problems are not new. There are new modalities by which we're seeing them express themselves. And then also we're seeing new and innovative and in some cases really promising and hopeful approaches to addressing them. So we're going to try to touch on all of that today. My name is Brian Hughes. I'm both your moderator and one of the presenters. I'm a research assistant professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University in the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology. But I'm also the founding co-director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, snappy acronym PERIL, at the School of Public Affairs. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about PERIL and a little bit about the way that PERIL tries to address these issues of hate crimes and all the associated social ills and social, emotional, individual, and collective vulnerabilities that give rise to these. Let me just share my screen here. And then I'm going to present here. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Somebody message me if there's a technical problem. Excuse me. PERIL tries to apply what we call a public health approach to these issues of targeted violence, intolerance, supremacist ideologies, conspiracy theories, dis and malinformation, propaganda, male supremacy, and so on. Those are the really big issues that we look at. Our mission is to utilize a public health approach to design, test, and then scale up evidence-based tools and interventions that are aimed to prevent these very problems. Now, what does it mean to take a public health approach, though? I think that's the question. We try to think of it this way. When we talk about responding to issues like hate crimes or like political violence, extremist violence, terrorism, what have you, we often think of it as being a sort of three-step approach to dealing with the issue. You have what are called the tertiary responses. Now, these are long-term responses that are intended to address extremism, political violence, hate crimes, and so forth after they've already occurred. So a tertiary prevention might be, for example, de-radicalizing someone, right? Somebody goes to prison for committing a hate crime, realizes that they've done something horrendous and wants to change. It's not just as simple as making a declaration and suddenly your mind and your heart is healed now. There's all kinds of social, emotional, and behavioral work that has to be done, and that's very essential. And there's some good groups doing really good work on that these days. Then we have what are called secondary prevention approaches. Secondary prevention approaches are intended to disrupt potential violent threats either as they're occurring or just before they're occurring. So something like reporting to law enforcement or social services is an example of secondary prevention. Let's say that you have a cousin who is speaking very recklessly and talking about wanting to commit an act of violence. If you were to report them in a state that has a red flag law, have their guns taken away, and thereby prevent a hate crime from happening or an act of terrorism from happening, that would be considered a secondary intervention. But then below that, there's what's called primary intervention approaches. And these are, as it says on the slide, the efforts to minimize the risk of radicalization in the first place. So in other words, how do we reduce the social and emotional conditions that can give rise to the risk of hate crimes in the first place? So, there are a great many vulnerabilities that are associated with people who might commit hate crimes. These have to do with things like trauma is a very common one. People who commit hate crimes tend to have very high adverse childhood experience scores. There are also issues of social isolation, but then there are also issues of social embeddedness. People who are embedded in certain social milieus where political violence, extremist violence, hate and bias are accepted or even celebrated, that's another vulnerability. So the idea with a primary public health based approach is how do we reduce those vulnerabilities across the board? And that's the way that Peril tries to look at all of this. Now, this is just to say very quickly that primary prevention has been a bit underutilized. It's not to say that tertiary and secondary prevention aren't important. They're critically important. And that might even be why the focus has been on them so much to date. But in the end, they can really only be a Band-Aid. They can only ever be a sort of after the fact way to address these issues, either after the absolute worst has occurred, in the case of a hate crime actually being committed, or something very bad occurring in the case of a person being radicalized in the first place. You know, a person being radicalized needs to be seen as a policy and practice failure in its own right. And we want to be able to avoid that. This is also to reduce the burden on law enforcement, social service, and so on. All those folks who are tasked with secondary and tertiary prevention. If we can build up a more robust primary prevention practice, that distributes the expense and effort more evenly, more equally, and hopefully more efficiently. So I don't want to take too long. We're only supposed to have about 10 minutes here. Let me just double check how much I've got going. Okay. We've got a little bit of time. So the approach to public health that we take is based on 4 principles. So the idea here first is to focus on the needs of the communities, which means that any intervention that we undertake has to be community driven. We are based in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to anyone that when you get someone on the phone or on Zoom, or you meet them at their church or their school or somewhere and say, I'm from Washington, D.C., and I have solutions to your problems, that's not something that people respond very well to. So instead, we try to put ourselves in a position of being facilitators and a resource that communities can use to help develop their own interventions to address their own needs and their own problems as they understand it. The community is really the best assessor of what it needs in order to resolve the problems that it perceives with itself, and then also the best source of determining what a better future for itself looks like. The idea here is that a true public health approach is going to be holistic. It has to be whole of society, and it even has to be whole of government too. You know, a good analogy for this might be the way that public health thinks about something like diabetes and obesity. Now, you can look at a map and you can see that diabetes and obesity is particularly acute as a public health problem in low-income areas. And you can take a sort of primary preventative approach to diabetes in impoverished regions by saying, okay, well, we're going to make diabetes screening available in these communities. But that isn't really a holistic way of viewing it. A more holistic way of viewing it would be to go deeper and say, oh, well, these communities are food deserts. They don't have good sources for fresh produce. These communities sometimes are unsafe. People don't have good places where they can go for a walk. They don't have good places where they can exercise. And so the sort of the further down you drill, or the further out that you zoom, the more you're able to find these broader whole of society ways of intervening. And we try to apply that general principle to our interventions against things like hate crimes. Evidence-based, obviously. All of Peril's work is IRB vetted. It's all based on social scientific methodologies. Most of it ends up getting published in peer-reviewed journals. And this is because it's important to actually know what works. And the idea here is that we want to create resilient systems, right? Not just resilient individuals or protected individuals, but entire systems that are able to better respond to the risks that are associated with these problems. Again, the analogy of diabetes applies here. A community that has a farmer's market and a safe park where people can exercise and walk is a system that's resilient to something like the threat of diabetes. And so we want to be thinking in those very terms when we're looking at these issues of politically and identity motivated violence. In order to do this, I'm going to wrap this up with just a little pitch. If anyone is curious to know about the interventions and the studies that we've produced in our 3 to 4 years of existence, you can go to perilresearch.com, and we have a variety of resources that are free to the public that are aimed at stakeholders in the communities who are often overlooked in the secondary and tertiary prevention approaches. So folks like educators, school psychologists, social workers and counselors, clergy, not that clergy aren't involved in secondary prevention, but clergy is one of the folks that we work with too. So I'm going to leave it there. If anyone has any specific questions about any of these projects or our approach to it, we can get to it in the Q&A. You should have the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to stop sharing now. There we go. So yeah, feel free to start dropping questions in the Q&A, but in the meantime, I'm very happy to hand things off to Barbara Perry. So Dr. Perry, if you could please introduce yourself and then take it away.
Sure. Hi. Thank you for that, and thanks for the invitation as well to today's onto today's panel. I think we're in for some very interesting conversations given the context and the times we're living in. Such important conversations that I know we're having at multiple tables across the globe, and certainly across the continent and our own country. So shout at me very loud when I get to about 12 minutes. I'm going to set my timer as well. So between the two of us, hopefully I won't go too much over time. I wanted to talk about sort of the Canadian context. I feel like much of our audience is probably American, and you know, you think we're all such peaceful, loving people north of the border, and I'm afraid that recent trends belie our long reputation as peacemakers, and as you know, a welcoming country. I mean, you know, I think we still are, but that is not everyone's experience, obviously. If we think about what we've seen in the past, probably 10 years or so, as I'll get into. So I wanted to talk really about a continuum of hate from the online space up to extremism as well. And I think it's important to contextualize it. You know, what are these turbulent times that we are referring to here in the title of the session today? And what are the contemporary flashpoints that have given rise to some of the patterns that we've seen here and abroad as well? And I think you can all think about how these kinds of issues that I'm reflecting here have shaped and given voice to a whole array of manifestations of hatred, have vilified particular communities, and made it more acceptable, as I'll speak about in a moment, to engage in violent speech and violent action against these communities, and I think it's important that we recognize that that it is you know, a series of, and that was, you know, that not an exhaustive series of factors by any stretch, but whoops, sorry, keep hitting the wrong button here. But certainly, you know, it is this cluster of flashpoints, if you will, that have enabled or contributed to what we see as the normalization of hate. And I think, you know, we sort of we like to blame it on Trump, but there are already glimmerings in the Canadian context of anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia at the sort of at the very public level in terms of political actors, political leaders, and just some examples here of the way in which some of those in the Canadian context, in terms of narratives, but also increasingly in terms of policy, have provided this permission to hate, or help to develop this hateful environment, if you will. And most recently, and I think paralleling what you're seeing in the US are a whole series of anti-trans policies that we're seeing pop up at the provincial level in Canada and some school districts as well, really targeting youth in particular, but much more broadly than that. And it has sort of vilified the community, the references to this, this queer agenda, this trans agenda, sort of have resurfaced in a way that enables not just hateful policies, but hateful narratives and actions as well. And we have seen, in fact, quite dramatic increases in public attitudes that reflect, first of all, I think the recognition that it has become more acceptable to express these attitudes. As we see here, 33% feel that we are freer to publicly express these negative views associated with other communities. That it's become more acceptable to express prejudice against Muslims and Jews in particular. And I think what's really worrying is if we look at changing attitudes towards immigration in the Canadian context, and especially this last one, 37% feeling that current immigration patterns are a threat to white Canadians, right out of the playbook of white supremacists and far right actors. So very worrying trends that we're seeing there that then become reflected in online hate crime, right-wing extremism. And I think it's important to think about the harms of online hate. Some of them are very similar to offline hate, but some of them are different as well. So the harm done to its targets, and so that's very much the same as what we would see with hate crime, that is instilling fear and anxiety amongst a community. But it also, increasingly the online narratives that we hear also create that risk of mobilization and radicalization. And we've seen that in the context of the mass murders that we've had in the Canadian context, all of the actors who were very active online and very much engaged in both as consumers and to some extent as producers of online hate. So very close connection there. And of course, these sorts of discourses in the online space also, have very dramatic impact on public polarization, on public discourse, and consequently on our core values. And I think I don't need necessarily to remind people of how many spaces in which it becomes possible to be subjected to online hate, both direct attacks on individuals and organizations through, targeted emails, through targeted messaging that goes out in broader social media platforms, but also, sort of those more indirect attacks that vilify particular communities through a whole array of online forums, web pages, etc., especially in the fringe. And that's where you really run the risk of radicalizing and deepening the narratives of folks who have come to Gab, who have come to Telegram, for example, looking for safe spaces in which to express their hatred. I think one of the areas that many of us are starting to pay attention to in particular are the gaming platforms. We've been paying attention to the music and to the videos, but the gaming platforms, I think, are increasingly dangerous spaces, if you will, in terms of recruitment, especially youth, but adults as well. And it's not just the games. I mean, some of the games are bad enough. I mean, we still have ethnic cleansing available online. For how that happens, I don't know. But it's really also the ancillaries that are associated with the gaming platforms, the chat rooms, for example, where people are pulled into darker and darker worker spaces through direct engagement and development of friendships or relationships that then enable recruiters to draw people into the movement. And so, not surprising that there is, a recognition amongst users that hate is alive and well in the online spaces. So, 60% of Canadians. Sorry, I'm just going to do that. Overall, report sightings of online hate. Even more youth, of course, because they're more likely to be in those online spaces than adults, even. So, really dramatic exposure there. Um, Sort of moving up the extreme, we see how these sentiments are then manifest in hate crime specifically, and such a dramatic increase that we've seen in recent years. 2022, some of the preliminary data are coming out, and we've had another increase in 2022. Also, 2023, in the context, especially in the last quarter of the year in response to the Gaza conflict. So rates of Islamophobic and anti-Semitic hate crime have climbed dramatically in that very short period of time, and will follow that will fall into 2024 as well. So just looking 2019 to 2021, for example, that's a 72% increase in police reported hate crime. Really dramatic there, and you see that in the blue, the areas where we're seeing the most increases racially motivated, and in particular in the Canadian context, that is accounted for by an increase in anti-Black hate crime, anti-Indigenous hate crime, and if you look at the years here, 2020 in particular, anti-Asian hate crime in the context of COVID as well. But you see also in the red, religiously motivated hate crime, also represents a sizable proportion of the victimization in our context. And I think it's important to put this in another context, and that is that these dramatic increases in hate crime are occurring at a time when we're not seeing similar increases across the board in terms of criminal activity. So, I mean, in terms of criminal harassment, for example, really dramatic compared to the very minor increase in non-bias motivated incidents of criminal harassment. If we look at common assault, we're seeing that non-bias motivated assaults actually decreased a little bit, while common assaults motivated by hatred increased. So, something to keep in mind. I'm not sure if that's a similar pattern to the U.S. I know the increases in hate crime are. I'm not sure what the broader increases in crime are there. And so this, sort of falls into that gray area between, what is extremist violence, what is hate crime. We've had a very recent decision here. Some of you may be aware of that the young man who killed 4 Muslim people in London, Ontario, a couple of years back by driving over them with a bus, or sorry, with his truck, he was found guilty, and the judge has determined that that was an act of terrorism, which is the first time that first-degree murder has been associated with terrorism and the first time that terrorism of that level has been recognized in terms of right-wing extremism, white nationalism in particular, self-professed, white nationalists there. And this is what we're seeing. This is sort of the typology that we're developing, looking at what the far right looks like in the Canadian context. It's become much more amorphous, much more atomized in many respects. That is that, there are still some active groups, but individual engagement with these ideological threads, sometimes weaving them together, is much more characteristic of the far right movement in the Canadian context now than it had been at the end of our first study in 2015 or so. Where we were seeing at the end of 2015 study, very traditional neo-Nazis, skinheads, and where they white supremacists, we've seen those threads sort of being unpacked around gender, around where are we? Muslims specifically, around Jews specifically. We've seen a rise in Christian fundamentalism in the Canadian context, which is really unusual, and a really dramatic increase in the anti-authority movement. We did a small study after 2015, I think in 2017 or so, looking at the anti-authority movement specifically, and it was starting to dwindle at that point in time, but COVID gave that movement a whole new life. So, and it's remained as in sort of taken the form of this freedom movement in the current context. And we see the dire consequences of this rise in right-wing extremism in the number of mass murders that we've seen since 2014, attributable to some thread, one of those threads that I just referred to there of far-right extremism, beginning with 3 RCMP officers who were murdered, 6 Muslims here, 10 people immediately killed. This was the van attack in downtown Toronto, incel adherent there. The 11th person died a couple of years later, of the wounds suffered in that attack. Then the 4 family members in London who were killed in 2021. And this one that has been very, very quiet, but an individual affiliated with a virulently white supremacist group called Holy Europe, who has killed, as allegedly murdered at least 4 Indigenous women, and there are fears that there might be more as well. So both racism and misogyny coming into play in that particular context. So for a small country, sadly we really punch above our weight in this context, disproportionately high numbers of deaths associated with the far right. And a number of important trends are referred to the atomization at the beginning of the second, what we're calling environmental scan in 2016, 2017. We were seeing dramatic increases in the number of active groups, many of whom sort of fizzled out, many of whom were also designated as terrorist entities in the Canadian context, which was also part of the reason why they've fizzled out. Incredible demographic shifts. And I think you really saw that in the US around the insurrection. If you think about the number of sort of middle-aged and older people engaged there, well-educated, we saw professionals, we saw white-collar folks, those who were not just these disenfranchised young men in particular, but gainfully employed, well-employed, white-collar folks being drawn into the movement. And I think that suggests the strength and the canniness of the far right movement to exploit broad public fears and co-opt them and weave them into their own narratives. We're seeing much more coalition building amongst the movement. Within the movement. And again, I think the insurrection, the convoys, the Canadian convoys that we saw challenging public health provisions a couple of winters ago, another example of that. And one of the most frightening trends that we're seeing is this unholy trinity of a new, almost American style guns rights narrative in the Canadian context. I mean, even the Proud Boys saying, we love our guns. So we have that. We have the active recruitment and engagement of folks with military and law enforcement experience, and then of course the hateful ideologies, and you put those 3 together, and I think it signals a dangerous turning point, as we've seen with so many mass murders and homicides in the Canadian context. And then the last thing that I was going to talk about, and I won't, and because I think others are going to talk more about interventions, and these are just very general ways, areas and spaces in which we need to intervene. I will say the last thing I'll say is that just this week, finally, our online harms bill was introduced to the legislature here, which includes not just strategies and legislative reform around online hate, but also proposes the introduction of standalone hate crime legislation as well, and an explicit definition of what constitutes hate, making it that much easier for law enforcement to recognize and enforce as well. So I will leave it there for now, and looking forward to questions and conversation at the end.
Thanks very much, Dr. Perry. That was a very interesting presentation. I definitely I have some questions to ask you about. I'm very curious to hear about some of the anti-authority movements, as well as some of the transnational dimensions of all of this. But why don't we save that to the end? We might be able to fold it into some of the audience Q&A too. With that, I'd like to pass things along to Candace Cho, who is the Managing Director of Policy and Counsel at AAPI Equity Alliance. Candace, if you'd like to just introduce yourself a little bit and share your thoughts with us today. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And thank you, Dr. Perry, for setting the table and debunking American myths about Canada. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, so give me a moment. Okay, can you all see my screen? And is it a slideshow and not my notes? Great. Okay, I'm also going to start the timer and stay within my 12 minutes. Good morning, everyone from Los Angeles, California. Thanks so much to the Orion Policy Institute for the invitation to spend a little bit of time with you. Thanks to all of you, too, for showing up in this space. We know there are many other things you could be doing with your time than learning about the rise in hate against all of our communities. As Brian mentioned, my name is Candace Cho. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Managing Director of Policy and Counsel at AAPI Equity Alliance. We are a Los Angeles-based nonprofit. We're also one of the co-founding partners of the coalition Stop AAPI Hate, which is the nation's leading center for acts of hate reported by Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. And this is where I lead on developing people-centered, data-based, data-driven policy. And before that, I worked as the chief legal advisor for New York City, advising on sanctuary city policies, laws, and lawsuits that protected immigrant New Yorkers during the Trump administration, and started my career working for U.S. Senator Dick Durbin, who's the second highest ranking Democrat in the U.S. Senate. So this is an appropriate moment to spotlight hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, which has really existed since as long as there have been AAPIs in the United States, but has been on the rise since the COVID-19 pandemic and with the perception of China as a major geopolitical rival. The most infamous example of anti-AAPI hate being the Atlanta spa shooting, which left 8 people dead, 6 of whom were Asian women. Hate against AAPIs is also especially acute during election years, especially with candidates and elected officials spewing more inflammatory political rhetoric that scapegoats immigrants and BIPOC communities. So in the next 10-ish minutes or so, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my organization and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. We will then dig into the data collected by Stop AAPI Hate on what anti-AAPI hate looks like, as shared by our communities in our own words. And then finally, we're going to pivot towards solutions on how to prevent, respond, and intervene when it comes to the rise in hate. So let's get started. So just a little bit about the AAPI Equity Alliance. We are an LA-based nonprofit. We're also a coalition of 40 community-based organizations who serve and represent the 1.5, 1.6 million AAPIs in LA County. So here's a snapshot of our organization membership. They do everything from direct services, such as delivering PPE to community speaking Bangla in Orange County, to political organizing of workers, to policy advocacy in Sacramento, the capital of California. AAPI Equity Alliance is also one of the co-founding partners of Stop AAPI Hate. Stop AAPI Hate was founded in March 2020 And we've become the leading aggregator of self-reported acts of hate against AAPIs. But we're more than a reporting center. We're also on a mission to end race-based hate against our communities and all communities of color. So I did want to spend a minute or so on who Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are. And here are the results of a nationwide survey conducted in the United States that show that most Americans, when they think of AAPIs, they really think of people who are Chinese. Or when they think of Pacific Islanders in particular, they think of people from Hawaii. When in reality, AAPIs are an incredibly diverse community. You see that we're large. We are one of the fastest growing. We come from over 95 countries or ethnic groups. We speak more than 100 languages. And a majority of us were born outside of the country, and a majority of us are US citizens. Now, the reason why I want to dwell for a moment on the diversity of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community is because of the model minority myth. So when anyone collects data about AAPIs and they don't disaggregate AAPI, the data may paint a really rosy picture of how AAPIs are doing. But when we disaggregate the data and break out Asian American Pacific Islander into Asian American communities and Pacific Islander communities, and then further break down each of those communities into ethnic communities, and other nationalities, we see that the picture is not quite as rosy. That in fact, there's vast income inequality within, for example, the Asian umbrella, that there are huge disparities when it comes to things like health outcomes, housing outcomes. And so that's why it's really critically important to acknowledge that our communities are diverse and that data collection about our communities also needs to be sensitive to that diversity. So what does anti-AAPI hate look like? Let's take a look at the data. And whenever I talk about data, what I want to start with are people's stories. And so I'm going to give everyone about 30 seconds to read 3 stories that were shared with Stop AAPI Hate by Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in their own words. In other words, the data that we collect is about what our communities are experiencing and what they're sharing with us. And unfortunately, these are just 3 of the more than 11,000 stories of anti-AAPI hate that we've received since March 2020 from all 50 states and the District of Columbia, 40% of which are in my home state of California. We also know that this is an undercount and really just the tip of the iceberg. We've done nationally representative survey work with the Edelman Data and Intelligence firm, showing that up to 1 in 5 AAPIs nationwide experienced hate during the pandemic. So if we do the math, the real number is in the millions. So here's a quick pop quiz. What percentage of reports to stop AAPI hate are of hate crimes? Give you all a couple seconds to think about it. For those of you who selected D, less than 25%, you are correct. And I think this is surprising to most people who we talk to, because when most people think about anti-AAPI hate, they think about hate crimes. But really, a majority of the hate reported to us by our communities involve experiences that are non-criminal. They don't involve crimes at all, let alone hate crimes. Instead, it's things like verbal harassment in the streets or on public transit. It's being bullied in school. It's being discriminated against at work or in a business when you're a shopper. We've also learned that a majority of hate that our communities are experiencing and reporting to us happens in public spaces. So in other words, when we're going about our everyday lives, going for a walk or run in the park, shopping for groceries, taking the bus to work. And that's why the Stop AAPI Hate Coalition has a broad definition of hate that goes beyond hate crimes, because that's what our communities understand hate to be. It's not just the most high-profile hate crimes against Asian Americans that we see in the news, but it's other forms of bias-motivated harm that make us feel less safe, such as street harassment or discrimination. It's not just interpersonal, meaning between two people, two individuals, but it's also systemic and structural, such as our racist immigration laws or the current land bans that we're starting to see in Texas and Florida. Not only are we do we do community reporting, but we also do nationally representative survey work. And one survey that we've worked on recently is with NORC at the University of Chicago, a nonpartisan independent research firm. And we started looking at discrimination as experienced by AAPIs, because that's what we were hearing from our reporting center. So here are two stories that I'll share with you, and I'll give everyone a few seconds to read these. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a very broad definition of hate. I'm going to fly over this for time. And in order to dig into one of those lesser known aspects of hate, discrimination, we partnered with NORC in order to conduct a nationally representative survey of Asian American and Pacific Islander adults on discrimination and civil rights. And this survey asked people about their experiences being discriminated against, reporting their discrimination, and their awareness of and attitudes towards civil rights. I'm not going to have enough time to go into all the interesting results, but I did want to highlight two. One of which is that half of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders nationwide have experienced the kind of discrimination that is probably illegal. In other words, they were discriminated against based on a protected characteristic, like their race or gender, in a setting that civil rights laws reach. And you see a few of them here. Stores where you're a customer, at work, on the bus, in school, when trying to get housing. Discrimination also has serious impacts, just like any hate crime would, on our mental health, on our feelings of safety, on our feelings of belonging. So in the last minute or so, I'm just going to preview some of the work we've done on the intervention front. And one key point I wanted to make is that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders seek holistic and comprehensive solutions. So it's not just about more policing or more hate crime laws. In fact, when asked for the top 3 solutions to anti-AAPI hate, they picked education, community-based solutions, and civil rights enforcement over more policing. We also asked in the NORC survey if Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders think new civil rights laws are needed to protect them against discrimination, and 2/3 of our survey respondents agreed. So at Stop AAPI Hate, we've developed a number of state and federal policy recommendations. We believe that policy should be made, influenced by, and informed by the people who are directly impacted by it. And so I won't go into these in detail. I'll just highlight one of them, which is our No Place for Hate California agenda. So one of our main policy recommendations and initiatives grew out of rereading the 4,000 stories of hate that we received from AAPIs in California. And when we saw that the major experience of hate had to do with street harassment in public spaces, we developed No Place for Hate California, which is a campaign and a policy package to make these public spaces safer for all communities of color and all marginalized communities against verbal harassment, much of which is protected by the First Amendment here in the United States. And we're really excited that we managed to pass 3 new laws to make public transit and businesses safer. And you can read more about that on the campaign website at noplaceforhatecalifornia.org. So thanks so much for listening. I'm going to stop there and come in right at the 12-minute mark, and I'll pass it back to Brian.
Thank you, Candace. Thanks for an excellent presentation and for coming in precisely on time. That's every moderator's dream. So I'll save my questions till the end for you as well. And we'll shift here to hear from Todd Green, who is with Interfaith America. Todd, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself a little bit and then letting us know what you're here to share today. Thanks.
No, thanks, Brian, and thanks to my colleagues here for it's already a fascinating conversation. A little bit about me. I'm a religious studies scholar by training, particularly a historian of religion. I was a religious studies professor at Luther College in the United States for 14 years before I transitioned into this current position I have, which is as the director of campus partnerships at Interfaith America. And at Interfaith America, I help consult with colleges and universities on how to enhance and deepen interfaith cooperation and learning on early campuses. My research area in my career has focused predominantly on Islamophobia. I've written books on the topic. I've consulted with various institutions and entities, including the media, government agencies here in the United States, some government agencies in Europe, legal scholars along those lines, and obviously these days a lot on college campuses. And to the topic at hand, I need to start off by saying I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so you'll have to look at me, and I'm sorry about that. I do have just some reflections. I've really been trying to think about the angle to take here because I wanted to focus on anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crimes, and particularly what we're seeing the past few months, because that is the conversation I am having, or people are having with me on college campuses over and over and over again right now here in the United States. That is the conversation. So I wanted to share some of my reflections on that, and maybe something that could be helpful to generate a conversation after this is over. Hate crimes against Jews and Muslims have been in the news a lot here in the United States since the October 7th Hamas attacks. According to the Anti-Defamation League and the Council on American Islamic Relations, anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crimes spiked in the weeks after October 7th. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, reported a 337% spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the week following October 7th, or the weeks following October 7th. Council on American Islamic Relations, I think it was around 127, 172, 73% spike in Islamophobic incidents in the weeks after October 7th. Of course, the question is what explains these spikes, and maybe the answer may seem obvious, but it's the obvious I want us to interrogate a little bit more. There's an obvious correlation, of course, between these spikes and the political and media attention given to the Hamas attacks and to the ensuing war in Gaza. But why would these attacks or the subsequent war generate such a sharp increase in hate incidents here in the United States? And to get at this question, I think we need to do a better job here in the United States in addressing what anti-Semitism and Islamophobia share in common, both historically and in the current political environment, in terms of how they operate. And I think we need to do this, and this is my big talking point, I think, today. I think we need to do this because we are currently in a political climate in which Jews and Muslims are frequently pitted against one another. And anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are played off against each other politically, as if we have to choose one of these or the other, one community or the other, one prejudice or the other to really focus our attention on, to really invest our political resources in terms of responding to, because one of these is a real problem, or one of these communities is really suffering, and the other one we're not so sure about, right? That's the larger political narrative, I should say, and it has having an impact in vast swaths of American society, including, as I see, on a lot of college campuses today. The pressure, I think, is just enormous right now to choose sides when it comes to where we show our empathy and our compassion and where we put our political and civic energy. But I believe that this antagonistic framing is detrimental both to Muslims and Jews, and it's counterproductive in our efforts to counter the rise in prejudice against both communities, and frankly, many other communities as well, when we're playing these communities off against each other politically. So what do anti-Semitism and Islamophobia share in common? I have a lot of interest in this question as a scholar, and I've been working on this off and on for some years. Frankly, I don't get to have this conversation as often as I would like because there's not a lot of will to have this conversation right now. But let me say this. What they share in common is that they both operate out of a guilt by association mindset. And that's because both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are animated and fueled, among other things, they're animated and fueled by a combination of racism and nationalism. Jews and Muslims historically are racialized communities. And yeah, we could talk about that in terms of skin color, but it's not just about skin color. When I talk about racialization, because racial constructions have never been solely rooted in skin color, because whiteness is not a static category. It's a very fluid category that helps to determine amongst a certain population who's in and who's out, who belongs and who doesn't. And as we know historically here in the United States, you have the Irish in the 19th century or Eastern European Jews immigrating, many of whom were not considered fully white. And that might seem odd to say today, but when I tell my students this, they often responded like, wait, they didn't think the Irish were white in the 19th century. Did they look at the Irish? But they start to recognize, okay, whiteness itself and racial constructions aren't so static, right? They have political motivations, and they're adaptable, they're malleable, depending upon the context. And so that's important to keep that in mind when talking about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as well. So by racialization, then, I mean that both Jews and Muslims, amongst other things, are treated as monolithic communities. They're treated as collectives. And for this reason, both communities have been subjected to collective punishment and targeted with hate, intolerance, discrimination, and violence. And we see that, just in the rise in hate crimes in post 9/11, particularly in a couple of months after the 9/11 attacks, Muslims subjected to a lot of Islamophobic incidents and hate incidents, not because Muslims here in the United States had anything to do with the Al-Qaeda attacks, but because of that guilt by association mentality, that being treated as a collective. And if the only Muslim I kind of know about is a guy named Osama bin Laden, then according to this mindset, I feel like now I know something about 1.8 billion people. That's what I mean by the racialization process here. And it has been operating both against Jews and Muslims for all of modern history, to be sure, if not longer. So again, this is not only about skin color, though skin color certainly plays a role when it comes to Black, South Asian, and Arab communities, many of which are communities where people might be perceived to be Muslim, irrespective of whether they actually are or not. With the Jews, again, we should bear in mind that many Eastern European Jews in the 19th century were not considered fully white. There's a whole body of scholarship on how Jews became white and how the Irish became white, which I don't have time to get into today. But that is a historical sort of evolution and process. The importance of this, obviously, with the Jews in modern history is not limited here to the United States. We certainly know in the 20th century in Germany, these German constructions of a mythical Aryan race that were predominant were often targeting Jews, constructing German national identity over against this idea of Jewishness and Jews being excluded because they weren't part of this constructed mythical Aryan race. And that's part of the racism that was undergirding that. So all this is to say that racism has been one of the pillars propping up anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in modern history. We are still seeing this racialization at work today in the form of hate incidents and crimes targeting Jews and Muslims. And the other pillar I briefly want to talk about is just this nationalism, which I've already alluded to. But both the Jews and Muslims have been used as foils over against which modern Western nations have defined national identity. And of course, again, I just mentioned that the case of Germany, which is frankly, there were dynamics happening in a lot of Europe in the 20th century when it came to defining Dutch identity or even British identity over against Jewishness. It wasn't limited to Germany. In more recent decades here in the United States and lots of Europe, Muslim minority populations have functioned as foils for national identity construction. This is particularly and explicitly the case on the far right, and we've already had presenters talk a bit about far-right dynamics, but prominent European and American far-right politicians, political parties have persistently raised questions about whether Muslims can be truly Dutch or fully French or authentically American. Muslims have been treated as a collective suspect population, a community that is deemed inherently disloyal to the nation and an existential threat to it. And if you know your history of anti-Semitism and modern history, all of that should sound eerily familiar. In short, racism and nationalism are the foundations of much of the modern manifestations of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that we're encountering right now. And that's one of the reasons these two prejudices often spike at the same time, whether around geopolitical conflicts or just as likely, if not more likely in many cases, during presidential election cycles here in the United States. Because in both instances, it's not uncommon for racialized and nationalistic narratives to take hold and be inserted very prominently in public and political discourse. I mentioned All of this because it's important to elevate these intersections of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, I think more than we're currently doing in this moment. Jews and Muslims have been subject to similar targeting, similar tropes, even as we can recognize that there are some obvious differences between the bigotries that each of these communities have experienced. And if we return to the past few months, what I think is worth considering is the extent to which the Hamas attacks and the ongoing war in Gaza have fueled Islamophobia here at home, because Muslims collectively get lumped into groups like Hamas, just as American Muslims were viewed as extensions of al-Qaeda in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And a similar framing takes place regarding Jews in the United States. Unpopular Israeli policies in Gaza or the West Bank, or the perception that the current Israeli government is an obstacle to a two-state solution, or the images we see about the widespread carnage in Gaza due to military attacks from Israel. All of this fuels anti-Semitism here at home because of this pervasive guilt by association mentality, this racializing that takes place that treats the Jews as collectives and therefore as scapegoats. Paying a bit more attention to these intersections will help nuance conversations about the recent rise in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate incidents, because too many conversations right now are focused on either one of these or the other, but not really taking them together and not really seriously digging into what they might share in common. In my current work, I've done a lot of engagement on college campuses in recent months, the kind of stuff that's interesting because college campuses in the United States are very much in the news a lot these days, and not in a good way. They're being tried in the court of public opinion when it comes to tolerance and intolerance, and they don't seem to be winning that trial. When I engage in these campuses, various Jewish and Muslim stakeholders tend to lift up either anti-Semitism or Islamophobia as the real problem that universities need to address. So for those audiences I encounter on campuses who believe that they've been targeted with anti-Semitism, they really have a lot of discomfort when the university leadership makes a statement that also includes attention to Islamophobia. It's as if that attention to this other group somehow dismisses their experiences and minimizes their experiences. And if I transition and talk to that other group, they're making the same argument just in reverse. The idea that we can talk about these two together from these two vulnerable communities and impacted communities is almost impossible right now in my experience on college campuses. So this is a very real problem, not just in Congress or on CNN. It's a very much a problem on the ground as well, as if anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are in a zero-sum game, just as Jews and Muslims, again, have been pitted against each other in some kind of zero-sum game. So I'll wrap it up here, just wanting to say that I hope we have time to talk a little bit more about constructive ways forward, what we do at Interfaith America in terms of our interfaith response to this, building relationships across difference, which we think is a data-driven approach to actually reducing prejudice. But also I recognize in this moment, particularly in these two prejudices, that this idea that you can build relationships and reduce prejudice seems very aspirational and lofty. And I suppose I'm in the business these days of being aspirational because the climate as such is almost the exact opposite, where the political gravity is trying to bring these two communities onto a collision course. And the work that we're trying to do at Interfaith America is to push against that, to, in the words of Wicked, to defy gravity, right? So we're working in this defying gravity space, and looking forward again to the conversations with my colleagues here and others on the call. But thank you. Brian?
Thanks so much, Dr. Green. Very much appreciate your comments there. I have been in a few conversations here at American University where I wish you had been there. I wish you had been there to help guide us. And who knows, maybe we might yet get you down here. But I think that this question of solutions is probably a really good place to start, because a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A, besides Dr. Hughes, why does your screen look wrong? And I apologize for that. Have to do with policy, and have to do with different kinds of interventions. And I recognize that each one of us and each one of the institutions or organizations that we represent approach solutions in a different way. There are policy solutions, but then policy solutions organizations that can be a matter of legislation, but that can also be a matter of, say, university policy or the policies of tech companies. It doesn't have to be a legal policy to be a policy means of addressing this problem. But then there are also personal and community ways that we can address these problems. So I'm curious to hear from everyone. Let's begin maybe with this question of policy, both in terms of legal policy and then private policy. Are there policy steps that we're not taking that we should be taking? Or are there policy steps that we are taking and we should continue to follow through on because they offer some promise of alleviating this problem?
I can kick us off. I'm excited to jump in on this because I'm a policy person at heart. So thanks so much for that question, Brian. And one of my questions is, what is the name of Dr. Perry's cat? I'm a little distracted. Very cute. So policies. I'm going to focus on government policies as opposed to business policies or online policies, and offer 3 recommendations for addressing hate against, in particular, vulnerable communities in the United States, such as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. One is to build the non-criminal infrastructure. So on the criminal side, we have hate crimes at the state and federal level. We have nationwide reporting on hate crimes that the FBI does. There's a lot of federal money to help state and local law enforcement agencies report on hate crimes. On the civil side, we just don't have that kind of robust infrastructure. So for example, let's say that my neighbor is harassing me for being an Asian woman. If I decide to call the cops, I grew up in a culture obsessed with law and order. So I know that one person I can call is a police officer. If I decide to call the police officer, he may say to me, or she may say to me, there's nothing I can do. There's no crime here. And in fact, we've received a lot of stories like that. Some states are actually leading the way in setting up that kind of infrastructure where you can report bias-motivated events or hate outside of the criminal context. So those are, for example, civil rights agencies that can take your complaint, or a program like California versus Hate, where you can report any kind of hate regardless of whether it's a crime or not. So that would be my first recommendation, is building up a holistic and comprehensive response to hate, especially for incidents, events, discrimination, harassment that is not a crime, because it's less clear to people who they can call if not the police or 911. My second recommendation is that government needs to do a better job partnering with community to close the gaps in trust. Unfortunately, in the United States, and I imagine elsewhere, in order to seek accountability for any wrongdoing against you, in order to kick off any criminal or civil enforcement mechanisms, it all has to start with reporting. The person who's the victim has to speak up and say something, which is actually quite unfortunate, because usually as a victim, you don't want to have to relive your trauma. But a lot of folks in the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, as well as folks in the Latinx and Black communities, LGBTQ communities, they will not report to government agencies, especially to the police. There's a huge trust gap because of the way that law enforcement and other government agencies have historically treated these communities, which is to say in a discriminatory manner, in a targeting manner. And so this whole universe of enforcement mechanisms doesn't become available because nobody is reporting. But one group that APIs, for example, will report to are community-based organizations who have been in the communities for a long time, who are trusted messengers. And in fact, in the NORC survey, when we asked who do you most trust to report your experience with discrimination to, the top answer was CBOs. And so governments need to partner with CBOs to not only get the information out there on where to report, but to help make sure that people feel comfortable reporting. And the third recommendation I'll make on policies is one that's critically important to especially Asian American Pacific Islander communities, and that's language access. When I think about someone like my mom, who is a Korean immigrant, she speaks English and Korean, but often she's more comfortable speaking in Korean. And so if we're serious about meeting communities where they are, if we're serious about making sure that every community, every person feels comfortable reporting hate as it happens to them, whether it's a hate crime or otherwise, we need to make sure that language is not a barrier to that kind of reporting. And unfortunately, too often it is. And this issue is especially acute among AAPIs, especially Asian Americans who have the highest level of language needs alongside, for example, folks in the Latinx community. So I'll pause there.
That's that's extremely practical and actionable advice that I think, we can begin to look at, not just from, I mean, obviously from a policy point of view, but this is something that our organizations can begin to or continue to work on as well. Peril does a lot of translation work. Most of our resources are being translated, bit by bit as the resources are available into other languages, into, Spanish. We've had some in Portuguese, but broadening that to encompass the full range of language needs is really, really essential. Uh, Dr. Perry, Dr. Green, what do you think about this this policy question?
Let me jump in because I thought we only had 75 minutes, so I'm going to have to go at 12:15 for the next one. And this is Joe, by the way. My kitten is Joe. um, and I really appreciate the work that that all of you do in sort of civil society respect, and that's really where I like to put my emphasis. I mean, I do a lot of policy consultation with government bodies, but I think that when they ask me what's the one thing that we can do as, whether it's a federal government or provincial or even municipal, to intervene in these spaces, and I say support the work of the folks who are already doing it. We have some really powerful civil society organizations, and, at the local level, at the national level, and some, obviously international organizations as well, who are doing incredible work around different ways to counter hate, around critical digital literacy, those sorts of practices, but especially for the smaller local organizations. I mean, they just they're not sustainable. They're on a 1-year grant, a 2-year grant. They're just starting to show promise, and there's no new funding. So I think we need to have excuse me, a robust infrastructure in place to support civil society work in these spaces, to ensure that there are viable funding bases, that there is support. And I think about multi-sectoral interventions here. That there are relationships built between universities, for example, and folks who do evaluation work, evaluation research in particular, relationships between them and civil society organizations, so that we can establish the foundations, we can establish that evidence base for viable programming and interventions. So it's really about building an infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure that allows the incredible ongoing work to continue, to offer existing programs, but to expand their capacity as well, and experiment with other alternatives. So that for me is always the number one priority, and it's sort of a combination of that, government support, but also multi-sectoral partnerships around these key problems.
Absolutely. And, I think the Canadian government funds prevention work, I think, to a disproportionately greater degree than the US government does. And the funding that comes from the government for prevention in the US, it comes from the Department of Homeland Security for the most part. I would love to see the Department of Education, Health and Human Services get involved in this, because there's so much that could be done there. And it begins to address these issues that don't yet rise to the level of criminality or acute violence, but create the conditions that violence and criminality come out of. We are actually scheduled to end at 12:15. So I'll ask maybe for any closing thoughts. Dr. Green, if you have any policy recommendations that you'd like to give in the last 60 seconds here, we'd love to hear it. But otherwise, we can just begin to wind things down.
My colleagues were very thorough, so I don't really have much to add to that, other than it would be great to see mandatory hate crime reporting. It's voluntary right now from law enforcement agencies, and frankly, even for some of those who do report, they don't necessarily always have the training or the resources to be able to, in the areas of Islamophobia, for example, to kind of identify what would constitute a hate crime that crosses that line. So more of that, but otherwise, the suggestions made here are phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, I wholeheartedly agree. And with that said, I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up for today. I hope all of our audience can join me in a round of virtual applause for our excellent panel here. Dr. Perry, Dr. Green, Ms. Cho, thank you very, very much for joining us, for sharing all of your expertise and your insights. I think we're all very much the better for it. We'll leave it there. Have a wonderful day, and I certainly hope to talk to you all again sometime.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Be safe.